Welcome to the Expert Series, where we explore the cutting edge issues shaping national security and defense. I'm Josh Malm, Director of Research and Analysis for the CDA Institute. Canada's National Security Advisor, Natalie Drouin, has dismissed claims linking senior Indian officials to criminal activities in Canada, labeling them as speculative and inaccurate. This follows a diplomatic fallout over Canada's allegations of Indian involvement in the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a pro-Khalistan activist, which has strained relations and highlighted Canada's broader challenges in managing sovereignty and security amidst growing global pressures from assertive powers like India. Today, to discuss the latest in Canada-India relations in the context of a shifting global security context, we welcome CDAI board member and former National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister, Mr. Vincent Rigby. This is the Expert Series. Well, thanks for tuning into the Expert Series podcast. Today, we'll have CDA board member and former National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister, Mr. Vincent Rigby. Vincent, great to have you on. So for a bit of context, today we'll be discussing the latest in India-Canada relations, and it has been quite a contentious, newsworthy year. So just this week, Canada's National Security Advisor stated that there's no evidence linking Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, External Affairs Minister or National Security Advisor to alleged criminal activities by Indian agents in Canada. And she called these suggestions speculative and inaccurate. So Canada-India relations have sharply declined following accusations by Canada that Indian agents were involved in criminal activities, including the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a pro-Khalistan leader. And India and Canada have since then expelled diplomats, with India dismissing the claims as politically motivated and halting key bilateral agreements. Meanwhile, Canada views India's actions as sovereignty violations. And so this has left the relationship strained, to say the least, especially over contrasting views on, the Khalistan movement and broader strategic priorities. And ultimately, I think the bigger picture here is that the situation highlights broader challenges for Canada in navigating a world where we are a mid-sized power and facing increasing pressure from larger nations. So with that context out of the way, Vincent, I'm wondering if you could briefly just touch on some of the broader implications for Canada's national security as it investigates the possible involvement of the Indian government in the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, and with that, maybe providing a bit of context for the situation as well.
Absolutely. First of all, thanks very much for having me on the show again, Josh. Really appreciate it. Always great to be back. I think you hit upon some of the key points already in terms of the broader implications. I think this is just, again, more evidence of Canada living in a very turbulent world where there are some major geostrategic shifts, and we are not immune to these shifts. And I think that we often think of hostile state activities, foreign interference, transnational repression coming from countries like Russia or China or Iran or North Korea. But here we have a country like India, which is supposedly a friend of Canada, which is supposedly a friend of the West, even though it straddles the fence a little bit. We know it's got close ties with Russia as well. But here's a country like India, if we're to believe the evidence that is being put forth by the Canadian government, that has carried out extrajudicial killings of Canadian citizens. And so we keep on saying over and over and over again, we commentators and experts, that Canada is under threat. We are not immune to a lot of the changes that are happening out there in the world. And so once again, we have direct threats to our national security, as you said, to our sovereignty. And I think it's another indication that we've got to wake up a little bit to how dangerous this world is. And when even friends, in quotation marks, are reaching out and doing these things, again, if we are to believe the evidence that's being presented, it's a wake-up call, another wake-up call, I think, for Canada to get its act together, to take its national security very seriously, to take the measures needed to protect our sovereignty, protect our territory, protect our people at the end of the day, and our democratic institutions, even our economic prosperity. So this is concerning, but for me, it's not an isolated incident. It's the latest in a long series over the last few years of incidents that have taken place by hostile state actors or by actors that have hostile intentions that are threatening us.
Uh, now, Vincent, you mentioned many times, and everyone who is involved in this ongoing kind of intellectual discussion has brought it up, or posed this question. But what do you think it might take for Canada to seriously prioritize its security? Or in framing that question, am I not throwing the government enough of a bone? Are there things happening behind the scenes that we could point to that are positive steps forward?
I think that over the last number of years, the government has taken some actions that are positive when it comes to our national security. We've been, I think, stronger on the defense side, notwithstanding the ongoing debate over 2% of GDP in terms of our defense spending, a lot of criticism around that. But we come out with two defense policy updates that I think are strong policies in and of themselves. We'll see if they pony up to the bar and provide the resources to implement those policies. But we're at least, I think, moving in the right direction. Maybe not fast enough for some of our allies and for NATO, but we're moving. We've created a National Security Council. We've created some very strong oversight bodies like NSI-COP and CIRA, et cetera. I think we've taken some strong measures um, with respect to economic security, strengthening the Investment in Canada Act. We've strengthened the CSIS Act with some measures recently. So there are things being done by the government. My argument always is, though, that they're very ad hoc. They're usually done in response to pressure. They're not holistic. They're not strategic in nature. It almost there's a sense of let's do this because we're getting criticism right now. Let's try and tick this box and move on. I still honestly believe, and I hope we're going to see this soon, is that we need a broader national security strategy that prioritizes what we need to do to defend our security here in Canada. That provides the resources to implement measures, and that really provides a sense of urgency, a direction that we need to take. So I don't like to be unduly negative about what the Canadian government has done over the last number of years. And if we go back to pre 2021, I have to take my share of responsibility because I was National Security Intelligence Advisor for 2 years. So I was advising the government. So I do think that some good things have happened over this period. I just think there has to be a greater sense of urgency, a greater sense of strategic direction, and I think that you know again, as I said at the outset, we're getting all these wake up calls. We're seeing what happened with China. We're seeing Russian activities, not just in Canada but around the world with respect to the invasion of Ukraine, upheaval in the Middle East. We're seeing Chinese threats in the Indo-Pacific region against Taiwan and other parts of that region. It's just a very turbulent world, and so when these things are actually happening on our territory, I think it is sending a signal to the government that they got to pick up their game. But I've said on numerous occasions that we're at a bit of a crossroads now. I think that the government has tried to start rebuilding the foundation of our national security. Um, and so with an election not too far around the corner, we could go one of two ways. We could have either the current government or a new government come in and go, well, there's some stuff being done over the last couple of years. That's good enough. We'll tick that box and we'll move on to other priorities. Or we can say, and this is hopefully the take of a new government. We're starting to rebuild that foundation, but we've got to do more. This is just the beginning, and the world remains a dangerous place. Will become probably even more unpredictable and perilous in the years ahead. So we've got to do more. So that's where I'm hoping we're going to go.
Well, thanks, Vincent. You mentioned the national security strategy, perhaps updating it or making it more robust. This is a topic you've written on and spoken about a lot. You've had a few articles with Mr. Janot on the topic. I'm wondering for maybe listeners who are unfamiliar with some of the ideas you've proposed, you know, what might the pillars of an updated national security strategy be for the decade we find ourselves in?
Well, I think first, what we need in a national security strategy is a clear articulation of the threat environment. And I think one of the reasons why governments have not been particularly active on the national security front is that Canadians don't understand what the threat environment is, and so they're not pushing governments to act. And you'll often hear politicians say, why should I be taking national security seriously when my constituents are never raising it? Well, they're not raising it because there's not a broad discussion initiated by government about just how dangerous the world is. So what I'd like to see in a national security strategy, right up front, is a clear articulation of what that threat is, and a clear articulation of the threat that is actually impacting Canada. And it's not a threat far away. We're not that infamous fireproof house anymore. We haven't been for a long, 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 long time. We can't rely on the United States to protect us, especially now with the Trump presidency. So I think any strategy that comes out should lay that out, first and foremost. I think it's got to be a very clear articulation of hostile state activities. And so, what we need to do in terms of counter espionage, in terms of countering threats to our economy, our democratic system of government through foreign interference, et cetera. I think as part of any national security strategy, you need almost a sub strategy dealing with foreign interference and the activities of hostile states. So that's got to be there. But I think that the definition of national security has expanded over the last number of years, and it's not just about traditional state on state threats, but it's broader now. It includes non-state actors. It includes the activities of criminal gangs and criminal groups, the implications of climate change. Climate change itself is not a national security threat, but it can have national security consequences and implications. The pandemic can have a national security dimension to it. I think as we saw with COVID a few years ago. So I think a national security strategy would lay out this threat environment, expand the definition of national security, focus on both state and then non-state actors, but also on transnational pieces, like I said, climate change and COVID, and clearly articulate what we need to do in response and provide the resources at the end of the day. I mean, we go on and on and on about the Canadian Armed Forces don't have enough money. I mean, you could make a strong argument that there's not been a big injection into our national security apparatus in over 20 years. The last time there was a big national security budget was 2002 after 9/11. And I'd say that the world that we're facing right now is probably a lot more dangerous than it was after the Twin Towers were brought down in 2001. I find it's a world that potentially is much more troubling. It's not just terrorism; it's so much more that we've got on our plate right now.
Oh, well, Vincent, thanks for that. I mean, I don't want to veer too far away from the initial topic of India-Canada relations, and I did kind of pose this question in a different form a little earlier, so hopefully it's not redundant. But um, the general Canadian understanding of national security threats, do you see this as maybe a messaging problem on behalf of governments, or is it something maybe deeply cultural about living in Canada, and might it take some kind of more, you know, tangible, might something more tangible need to happen that impacts Canadians before we maybe as a whole understand the necessity of investing more in our security and defense?
Well, it's a great point because I've often raised this that we don't have a strong national security culture in Canada, and I've argued, and Thomas Juneau and I in the report that we did with our task force of former deputy ministers in government, what we stated was that we don't take national security as seriously as we should in this country because we don't feel there's a direct threat to Canada, and we feel that if there is a direct threat, will be taken care of by the United States. So I intimated this before, and that obviously is problematic, and difficult to move forward if we don't articulate that threat, as I just said, in the context of a national security strategy. But I've also said that one of the great things about Canada is that we've never really had a 9/11 moment or a Pearl Harbor or the London subway bombing in, I think it was 2005, where 55 or 60 people were killed. We haven't truly had an event like that. We've rarely been directly under threat, which is why we often cite our geography, that we're far away from flammable materials. And I often say with tongue in cheek that, the most direct threat we've ever had was German submarines in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in the Second World War, which did some damage, but not that big a damage, or the Fenian raids from the 1860s or things like that. Um, so this is a good thing. But I sometimes fear that the only way that Canadians are truly going to wake up is if we do have a moment like that. And God forbid, we don't want there to be a moment like that. We don't want massive loss of Canadian lives. But that's often what wakes people up. And to this day, Americans will still refer to Pearl Harbor and surprise attacks, and 9/11 is now well over 20 years old, but it's still a signature moment in U.S. history and global history, obviously. But for the U.S. as a security issue, it's often raised that we've had 9/11 and we don't want to have another 9/11. 24 Canadians were killed in 9/11, but we often don't remember that. So um, we have had, and this is why I started off by saying that, bringing it back to India and these latest alleged Indian acts, it's not 9/11, it's not Pearl Harbor, but it should be a wake-up call, and there's been a series of these, right? We've seen all of the, we've had all these discussions about Chinese foreign interference. We've now got the Indian case. We've had the examples of Iranian transnational repression, um, foreign states reaching into diaspora communities and trying to intimidate them, and in some cases, silence them completely. All of these things are happening. So I'm hoping if we don't have a 9/11 moment, the cumulative impact of all these events will be a wake up call. And I'm really hoping that in the next election, these things are discussed because, as I said earlier, I can't think of a more unstable or unpredictable period in global history since the end of the Second World War. And so if we can have this discussion during election period and say, look at all the things that have happened recently, let's have a conversation about how Canada fits into all of this. What are we going to do at home? What are we going to do overseas to address these threats? If we can't have it now, when are we going to have it? So that's kind of my thinking. But you're bang on. I think there's a certain complacency because we've not had that big event, and I don't want it. I don't want to see it. Nobody wants to see it. But is that what it's going to take? I hope not.
Hard for maybe the average Canadian or casual follower of defense to believe that maybe this is happening in Canada. So perhaps our reaction time is a little behind. Vincent, you did bring up India again, and we've circled around the Americans and we've circled around Trump a little bit here. So bringing it back to India a bit more, with President-elect Trump now expected to return to the White House in 2025, vis-a-vis our relationship with India, do you see a second Trump administration impacting our relationship with India as well? I mean, the United States also had a similar issue with India with assassination plots on their soil. Do you see this changing the dynamic at all?
It's going to be interesting to see where Trump goes, and everybody's got a theory on Trump right now and what he's going to do. And we saw perhaps with respect to Canada the first broadside yesterday with the announcement on X that we're going to get slammed with 25% tariffs, and if we don't do something about our border and fentanyl, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's panic in the streets, and people are running around going, "What are we going to do? What are we going to do?" Could have seen this coming a mile away, I have to say. What's Trump going to do on India? Well, again, I think that we all know the West writ large, the United States in particular, is courting India, and they're courting India for any number of reasons. But one of the main ones is as a bulwark against China. And we know Trump's views about China. China is threat number one, more so than Russia and more so than many of the other threats that are out there right now. So in order to take on China, he's going to want India on side. Uh, he's got a good relationship with Modi. I'm not sure they have a bromance going, but they seem to have some kind of a personal connection. Modi thinks that he knows Trump and that they get along, so that might be in their favor. But I think at the end of the day, the Americans, much like now under Biden, are going to want Canada and India to get along. This is not in the U.S. best interest to have a NATO ally, a Five Eyes ally, at loggerheads with India right now. I think that the United States has sympathy for Canada's position. As you say, they're going through something very, very similar. In their case, U.S. has even laid charges against a former raw analyst, research and analysis wing, their intelligence agency, for involvement, as you say, in a plot to kill a Canadian American citizen, Pannon, in New York. So they're going through something very, very similar. But as I've written before, India treats the U.S. a lot different than they treat Canada. The U.S. is a global power. U.S. is a superpower. And so when the U.S. turns around and says, we've got a major issue here, India immediately goes, okay, we'll investigate it, drop hints that it's a rogue element within Ra that's at work here. Whether you believe that or not, who knows? But they've gone out of their way, I think, to show the Americans that they're going to take this seriously and try and help, and launched an investigation. In the Canadian case, the Indians are just digging in their heels. And, I said it when this latest episode happened in mid-October that things are probably going to get worse before they get better. They haven't gotten a lot worse, but they certainly have not gotten better. And media speculation, as you said at the outset, that Modi himself might be implicated or the foreign affairs minister may be implicated. This just gets the Indians even more worked up. So there's no end in sight to this. But I'm sure the U.S. at some point. I mean, we saw the photo op at the G20 where Biden is between Modi and Trudeau, and I was trying to get them to come together and have a hug. I mean, I'm being facetious, but there are at least smiles on their faces. That's something. But I thought that picture captured it very nicely. That's the U.S. in the middle going, "Come on, guys, let's make this work." And I suspect Trump would be the same way. And I think Trump is going to be even harder over on China than the Biden administration. So they're going to need their allies to get along.
Uh, Another international relations sort of question, alliances. Do you see this current kind of breakdown in relations with India as potentially negatively impacting Canada's efforts or interests in the Indo-Pacific region, where India obviously plays quite a large role in, as you said as well, the countering China, the West is courting India. Do you see any implications there?
Well, I think that the Indo-Pacific strategy that came out, I guess it's almost a couple of years ago now, if I'm not mistaken, um, it set out pretty clearly that India was key in that region, um, from an economic point of view, from a strategic point of view, and certainly as a potential bulwark against China. And so, for the strategy to come out and say, I'm not suggesting the strategy said that India was a linchpin, but that India was certainly a very, very important element of the strategy. And for the relationship to go south in a serious way, it can't help but hurt um, the chances for the ultimate success of that strategy being implemented. So, again, yeah, it does have an impact. I think it does hurt the prospects for the strategy to be implemented, at least from a security point of view, in particular. Um, but again, I don't think Canada had a choice but to do what it did with this latest episode. And I've written about that it's extremely, extremely unfortunate. But Canada was backed into a corner. Um, so it's not like you can. I'd written earlier that Canada and India should try and find ways out of this. And there are various things they could do. They could try and restart the trade negotiations. They could try more people to people contacts, track to diplomacy, all kinds of different things, lower the rhetoric just through some confidence building measures. But when India does something like that and intelligence comes out that, if accurate, shows that India has committed extrajudicial killing on Canadian territory, what is Canada supposed to do? So, so there's no easy way out here. There really is no easy way out. And I don't know what's going to break the logjam, but I don't see it. I don't see it being broken anytime soon.
Well, Vincent, thanks for what's been a great discussion so far. Before we wrap things up, I'm wondering if you have any final thoughts on anything we discussed. If there's anything you'd like to highlight you think we missed, or double down on something important, whether that pertains to ways Canada can safeguard its sovereignty, alliances, etc.
I think all I'd say, Josh, as I said at the outset, this is a very interesting time that we live in, and I think we're seeing mounting evidence to sort of bring it back to what I said at the beginning, that Canada cannot sleepwalk anymore. Canada cannot bury its head in the sand. And so when things like this happen with India, on top of all the other things that have happened over the last 3 or 4 years, it should be a wake-up call. So I'm hoping in the coming months as we head into a new election with a potential new government, a new government or a new old government, a new administration in the United States, which is looking for Canada to pick up its game. As I said before, that we seize the moment, seize the opportunity to pick up our game. And I mentioned that I think we're at a fork in the road here. We really are. We can go one of two directions, and we can tick the box and say that's all we're going to do for now, or we can get really, really serious about this. And I don't think we have a choice but to get really, really serious. So let's cross our fingers.
Well, good parting words. And Vincent, I know you have a lot on the go, so I really appreciate you taking some time for the CDAI podcast. It's always a real privilege and pleasure getting your insights in all these matters, and I know our audience will appreciate these insights. So thank you for your thought leadership. Thank you for everything you do just to educate people generally and for the country and for the Institute. And I hope we can keep doing this.
Absolutely. Thanks so much again for the invitation, Josh, and look forward to doing it again soon.
That wraps up this week's episode of the Expert Series. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a review, send us an email at josh@cdainstitute.ca, or reach out to us on social media. Your feedback helps us bring you content that's relevant and engaging. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Thanks, and until next time.